All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Rich Condon. I am one of the founding contributors to Pennsylvania in the Civil War blog, also the director of Civil War Pittsburgh. And tonight I'm joined by Cody here, who's also one of our contributors to Pennsylvania in the Civil War. And unfortunately, we don't have Jake and Kendrick with us this evening, but we do have a good show for you tonight because we're going to be talking about a particular person that is of great interest to both Cody and I, especially, being from the Western Pennsylvania area. I've always had an admiration for a guy named General Alexander Hayes. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about Hayes, his life prior to the American Civil War, talk about his merits and actions during the American Civil War, and then the memory of Alexander Hayes and how he's going to be perceived in the years following his death in 1864 at the Battle of the Wilderness, actually on this day, May 5th, 1864. So before we get started here, Cody, did you have anything you wanted to say?
Yeah, just a brief introduction here. My name is Cody Aish, and like Rich and Jake and Kendrick, I'm one of the founding contributors here to PennCivilWar. I run a Facebook page and blog called Cody Aish, Writer and Historian. For those who follow, you'll have seen recently a lot of Alexander Hayes posts covering a lot of the sort of subjects we'll be talking about tonight in more detail. My day job is at Seminary Ridge Museum in Gettysburg. On this topic of Hayes, I've had the opportunity to present at Gettysburg National Military Park last October, and coming up here, hopefully soon, though it is delayed due to the current circumstances, I'll have an essay being published by the Park Service called Protest After Pickett's Charge, Stonewall Hayes and the Birth of Anti-Confederate Sentiment at Gettysburg, about a subject that we'll be touching on this evening, Hayes's dragging of Confederate flags on July 3rd, 1863. So like Rich said, Hayes is an individual kind of near and dear to my heart, and studies a fascinating figure really for me, for especially military figures of the Civil War. One other minor piece here of some shameless self-promotion. If you go back to October for the Battles and Banter podcast, of which I'm a co-host, the audio of my lecture that I gave at Gettysburg is available there. So you can learn more in depth about that episode in particular of Hayes dragging flags at Gettysburg, which is kind of in the bulk of my study of Hayes. But a pleasure certainly to be here to kind of pay homage to him here on the 156th anniversary of his death.
We'll definitely be sharing that piece when it's published to the Pennsylvania in the Civil War page. I'll definitely be sharing that to Civil War Pittsburgh as well. And I'm really excited to get into this topic. It's something we've been wanting to talk about for quite some time. And the story of Alexander Hayes is pretty interesting. He's a very bold guy. He's very popular with the men who are under his command. You even see places now, there's several monuments to Alexander Hayes, and even several mentions of Hayes in multiple museums around Pittsburgh. Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall and Museum, for example, Heinz History Center. Even if you walk the streets of, say, for anyone who's familiar with the Pittsburgh area, Millvale, Hayes Street, sits right alongside Sheridan, Sherman, and Grant. So this guy was held in high regard, in the 1860s, even before that and following. So Cody here is going to give us a little bit of background, kind of tell us about Hayes' life prior to, during the American Civil War. So Cody, I'll kind of let you kick it off right here.
Sure. I will share my screen with everyone, some images here, some maps as we talk a bit about his battle record, especially. Let me bring that up. All righty. So Hayes is born July 8th, 1819, At the start of the Civil War, he's 42 years of age. And in the 4 decades prior to the conflict, he has led a pretty accomplished life. He had sort of big shoes to fill, especially for his father's sake. But Hayes was the fifth of 6 children to Samuel and Agnes Broadfoot Hayes. He's born at Franklin in Venango County. Let me go to a map here briefly. You can see Franklin toward the northwest side of the state for those unfamiliar. But as Rich said, he is mostly associated with the Pittsburgh area, where he will spend most of his life. But Hayes is going to go to West Point. He will be 20th out of 25 cadets, near the bottom of his class in 1844. He is an individual who comes from this sort of miniature military pedigree, if you will. His father was Irish-born, had been a United States immigrant, and he basically puts these pretty stringent kind of qualifications on Hayes at a fairly young age. His father was a militiaman, a treasurer. He served as a sheriff, a marshal, a judge for quite some time. And so Hayes is going to be going into the Venango Academy and ultimately to West Point. He'll be part of the class of 1844. His roommate at West Point was Rufus Ingalls, who eventually becomes famously the quartermaster general of the United States Army during the Civil War. And then Hayes is also at West Point, both in his class as well as others who are around him simultaneously, as people like James Longstreet, who becomes a close friend of Hayes for a while, Richard Anderson, Lafayette McLaws, all of those individuals, of course, become Confederate generals during the Civil War. He's also classmates with eventual Union generals, George Sykes, John Newton, Abner Doubleday, Alfred Pleasanton, and his own eventual corps commander in the Second Army Corps in Winfield Scott Hancock. But the most noteworthy colleague of all is Ulysses S. Grant. We'll go back to these images here. On the left-hand side, Grant is the shorter man on your left side, and then Hayes, the taller individual next to him. This picture is taken in 1845, so it would have been the year after Hayes graduated from West Point. Both of them will become lieutenants in the 4th U.S. Infantry. They will serve with rather distinctive times in the Mexican-American War, and they'll both receive significant commendations during that period. Hayes, in particular, interestingly, will receive written recommendations for advancement, for bravery, by his future Civil War Corps commander, Samuel Heintzelman, the eventual commander of the 3rd Corps during the rebellion, as well as eventual Confederate sympathizer, Joseph Lane. So here we can see Hayes, prime example of one of those West Point graduates who has these connections to multiple people of renown on both sides of the eventual Civil War. But after he returns from Mexico, Hayes is going to start some other ventures, both public and private endeavors in business, in mining. He actually goes to San Francisco for a time to gold mine. He contracts cholera-like symptoms. This begins this period of real sickness and illness for much of his adult life, and that will carry through the Civil War, lingering effects of cholera. He temporarily goes blind on a couple of occasions. And so he has this kind of hard time, really, in terms of his health, between these two conflicts that really kind of define his legacy, the Mexican War and the Civil War. But in the Pittsburgh area, he will operate an iron furnace. He will be an engineer for a while on kind of Pittsburgh area railroads. He wants to lead a Western Pennsylvania militia unit, and he eventually does. This will be the Uniformed Militia of Allegheny County, and he had been a really respected figure before that as well. He was a Pittsburgh borough regulator in South Pittsburgh for a while. He was a surveyor. He was a civil engineer. So certainly an individual who, when war comes around, his military experience as well as his professional experience and his community experience will all play a role in him being able to raise a company called the City Guards, which is going to go into U.S. service at Harrisburg in April 1861 as Company K of the 12th Pennsylvania Volunteers. We'll go back to our map here. Hayes is going to first go to Harrisburg. He'll be placed at Camp Curtin. Hayes goes on this really interesting kind of evolution as the war goes on. And we can see this pretty much right away. When he's at Camp Curtin, he writes a letter home, and he says that this is named in honor of our governor, Andrew Curtin, but I wish I could say it was named in memory of Andrew Curtin. So right from the get-go, Hayes is making it clear he's a conservative Democrat. He's very much in kind of the McClellan mold, and he will certainly be an individual who at the outset of the war wants there to be really no progression that comes as a result of this conflict. Nothing in the way of civil rights, emancipation, nothing in the way of inflicting harm upon the South. But this completely changes as time goes on, as he gets further into the war. He'll then go further southeast of Harrisburg to Camp Scott in York. These are my old stomping grounds. For those who are from the York area, of course, there's the famous York Fairgrounds. The fairgrounds at the time of the Civil War were further southeast of where they are today. They would have been in the kind of the King Street area. And that was where Camp Scott was located. That's where Hayes is going to have kind of his first significant time in camp with the men of the 12th Pennsylvania Volunteers. His letters home make mention that it's raining almost the entire time. He says it's a generally miserable experience, but he is sort of excited about the prospect that he says that the people of York are having these kind of parades in the streets for the soldiers. He says this is something very much unlike the United States has really ever experienced, at least that he could recall. He'll go a little further south. I'll give you a few more images of him. This is later in the war when he becomes a general, but he is going to eventually go to Cockeysville, Maryland with the men of the 12th Pennsylvania Volunteers. He calls that, quote, the worst secession hole. And so it doesn't take very long for Hayes to kind of come out of that Democratic conservative mold and really start writing and speaking pretty adamantly against secession. He calls people traitors and says they're committing treason from a very early time. But his enlistment will run up. This is only I believe, a 3-month unit. And now he's a 42-year-old major. And so he really wants something more. He thinks his prior war experience, his West Point education, means that he should probably not only be placed in a United States regular unit rather than a volunteer unit. A common complaint, of course, of West Point educated officers. They didn't really like working with volunteers, at least initially. But not only does he think he should be given an officer's commission in one of those units, he thinks he should command one. And on June 24th, 1861, he will write, I have been tendered a captaincy. So not a colonelcy like he wanted. I have been tendered a captaincy. I will not accept. And should I be refused, what I believe is due to me, I will retire altogether from the service to spend my life in peace. I am determined to play second fiddle to no ambitious ignoramus. And here we see this real trend that Hayes is this defiant figure. He will partially get what he wants. He gives them this ultimatum, promote me or lose me. They do promote him to a colonel, but it's not a colonel of the regular army. It's a colonel of volunteers. He will simultaneously be promoted to a captain of the 16th United States Infantry in the regular army. But he's going to go back to Pittsburgh, and he will in turn recruit what becomes the basis of the 63rd Pennsylvania Infantry. A couple more images of him there. The right-hand image that you see appears, Rich and I will talk a bit more later about books about Hayes. That appears as the frontispiece in the 63rd Pennsylvania regimental history called Under the Red Patch. But these are the men of the 63rd Pennsylvania here. Their bugler, their fifer of Company A, William Morrow, gives what I think is one of the best descriptions of Hayes. He says he was a thorough soldier, hot and fiery and impetuous at times, but courteous and kindly withal. He infused his spirit into his men. At times his anger was terrible, and he highly regarded order and discipline in the camp. But he understood the benefit of amusements to the boys, commonly forgave offenses, and was always anxious for the welfare of his soldiers. Although he was reportedly one of the strict disciplinarians in the army, he had a heart as tender as a woman's. Before long, his aggressiveness as a field commander was known throughout the ranks. Hayes will send a letter to his wife, Annie. They had gotten married in 1846. He says that walking through the ranks of the 63rd Pennsylvania, I overheard one fellow say he had made his will before he enlisted under Alexander Hayes, and now he was glad of it. But still, Mrs. Hayes will express, she's able to visit her husband for a time. She notices that never was man so looked up to as he is by his men. He is doing well, so I have much to be thankful for. These men will enter the Civil War's Eastern Theater in October 1861. You can see on the right-hand side the tattered remnants and an image, a likeness of their flag. The left-hand side is his eventual headquarters flag. We'll talk more about when he is transitioning to the 2nd Corps in a little while. But the 63rd Pennsylvania is going to be part of the 3rd Corps of the Army of the Potomac under the command of Brigadier General Samuel Heintzelman, who had previously lauded Hayes's performance in the Mexican War. Hayes said, "We are now encamped upon the sacred soil of Virginia, about 4 miles from the United States Capitol." They were at Alexandria. He says that the fort that they're situated in is situated upon a high ridge overlooking the original slave mart of the Southern Confederacy. He's going to have these health flare-ups whenever these men are in Virginia. He has cholera once again. He has a severely bruised right leg. His horse had fallen and had partially trapped Hayes under him. He suffered from neuralgia in one of his eyes, temporary blindness, as well as a condition called amarosia. But Hayes is optimistic. He wants to get to the front line. He says, "God help our cause and God help the 63rd, for it will have a hard road to travel." When they do receive their flag, Mrs. Hayes is there. And she said the 63rd are as merry as crickets. As Alex passed along the beds, he had a cheerful and pleasant word to speak to all. He was visiting a Union hospital at one point. She says how kindly he was answered. Some tried to get up that they might speak to him or catch his hand. His influence is wonderful. Eventually, jumping ahead of ourselves to Gettysburg, we'll go back to pictures of him there. I can actually go off screen share for a little bit, but basically Hayes, his service with the 63rd Pennsylvania will continue in Virginia up until the time of the Battle of Second Bull Run or Second Manassas, and that's where he's going to receive a really grievous leg wound. He said a large ball struck the main bone between the ankle and knee, not breaking, but perhaps splintering it, glancing off and breaking the smaller bones. The entrance hole is as large as a $50. I assure you I have a sore shin, but a 1/4 of an inch variation would have cost me my leg. He's going to go home. He is initially given a 20-day leave of absence. Of course, it will take much longer than that to fully recover from this. So he's going to go back to the Pittsburgh suburbs in Linton, Pennsylvania. And while he's visiting Linton, we start to really see his transition. And it's kind of ironic that it's his time away from the battlefield that really seems to radicalize Hayes. And the reason for that is twofold. One, he's thinking about not being on the battlefield. This seems to really weigh at him. He wants to be with his men. He anticipated entering combat for so long. Suddenly that's been stripped away from him. But as well, he starts to notice that there appears to be a lot of this kind of anti-Union sentiment on the home front in Western Pennsylvania. He writes in January 1863, "Unless this war takes a new phase within 6 months, with traitors at home and the almost indomitable courage and perseverance of the rebels, we will be forced to acknowledge their independence, and Pennsylvania will be left a big unit to take care of herself. Once more again, give a good lick to traitors at home, and so to good loyal men that the day is dawning in spite of all opposition, for God is with us." And it starts to have an influence on many of his men. They start writing a lot of similar letters, especially once he returns to the army later that year. But he will also think back to the time that he was in Virginia before he was wounded. And he thinks back to the fact that he was on a farm of a man named George Mason, He says there were a lot of quote unquote secesh ladies in the area. And it was his yearning to quote, crush the monster rebellion to prevent sprouting. Ultimately, when Hayes returns, he is going to be given command. He wants to be given command of the Pennsylvania Reserves, but he'll be given a brigade in the 22nd Corps, kind of in the defenses of Washington. And then a position will open up when William French, former 3rd Division commander of the 2nd Corps, he's going to be sent to Harper's Ferry. And so what we will see is Hayes will transition back into the Army of the Potomac. He'll be given a command of a division under newly promoted Corps commander, Winfield Scott Hancock. And this will bring Hayes to Gettysburg, where we'll probably have his finest hour. I think many people would agree. Let me bring the screen back up here. So when Hayes arrives in the battlefield, his division is going to be given a position along Cemetery Ridge. On this map here, you have the 2nd Corps of Winfield Hancock. For those familiar with Gettysburg, town itself would be up here. These are the fields eventually of Pickett's Charge. Here you can see Longstreet's command. And basically right about here is where Hayes's division would have been placed. His headquarters will be at the farm of Abraham Bryan. His statue today would be right in this general area here. Hancock Avenue would be the road that runs along here. Hayes's men on July 2nd will be split up. Their 3 brigades will go in all directions. One of his brigades is going to move over toward Cemetery Hill. Part of his brigade, or one of his brigades, is going to be on Cemetery Ridge, go out toward the Bliss Farm, and eventually the famous burning of that property there. And then another brigade, the so-called Harper's Ferry Cowards of George Willard's command, who Hayes makes this comment that this brigade's operations have been written in blood. And he says that the acts of traitors at Harper's Ferry could not dissuade these men from fighting. And so they're going to be split all over the place. But by July 3rd, they're going to be consolidated here along the northern side of Cemetery Ridge. Pickett's charge will occur from your left to right, from west to east. Hayes's men will be holding onto the area to the right of the most famous action in Pickett's charge and its defense. Alexander Webb's Philadelphia Brigade will hold the angle, this general area here. Hayes's men will hold on to the stone wall where it kind of juts back toward the north. Now, Hayes, during and after Pickett's charge, is going to have several moments that are really worth mentioning. In his own words, he said, "Yesterday was a warm one for us." He writes to his father-in-law, John McFadden, the next day. "The fight of my division was a perfect success. We are all sanguine of ridding our soil of the invaders." And 3 days later, he tells his wife, Annie, "Our fight with the rebels on the 3rd was most terrific." He talks about some of the men he was facing he knew from the pre-war years, A.P. Hill, George Pickett, and several others. He says that they were swept from our stone wall by a volley like a tornado. But Hayes is also going to be kind of riding along his line. There will be instances in which he is going to be giving men kind of the manual of arms. He's kind of retraining them in the midst of action. He's waving his sword. He's waving his hat. In some accounts, you see that his coat is off temporarily. He's really kind of goading his men in order that they might further disallow the Confederate forces from penetrating their line. And then we'll have this famous instance in the aftermath of Pickett's charge. I have found at least 21 eyewitnesses, men of both armies, who talk about Hayes taking several captured Confederate flags and dragging them along Cemetery Ridge. And this is the area where that would have happened. On your top picture there, this would be the farm of Abraham Bryan. We're looking south in this direction. That's the 111th New York Monument. This is looking in the opposite direction. So this picture is taken from right about there and vice versa. This would be the Bryan barn in the distance there, 14th Connecticut. David Shields, who is Hayes' kind of trusted aide, he talked about the path that this went. And he says that it goes kind of behind the Union line, turns around near the Bryan farm, goes back in the opposite direction. You can see my cartographic skills put to the test there, the little map that you see on the right I created to just kind of give you a sense of what that would have looked like. But you see this fervor really kind of go through the lines. There's one account written by a man from New York who said, 6 feet or more in height, erect and smiling, lightly holding well in his hand his horse, the 3rd within half an hour. The flanks were bespattered with blood, tied to the streaming tail a rebel flag that drags ignominiously in the mud. Hayes dashed along our lines, rushing out in the open field, a mark for 100 sharpshooters, but never touched, quietly cantering back to our lines to be welcomed with a storm of cheers. I reckon him the grandest view of my life. I bar not Niagara Falls. It was the arch spirit of glorious victory, triumphing over the fallen foe. About 21 accounts that are similar to that, some more detailed, some less. The interesting thing about that account is that when it was printed in Hayes' own hometown paper, one of them, the Daily Pittsburgh Gazette, they specifically censored it to not include the line about the Confederate flag being dragged. Everything else was there. But in some newspaper accounts, including in Western Pennsylvania, intentionally, the fact that he was dragging Confederate flags is not included. Kind of an interesting reality there. There will be this famous painting that is created by Audley Dean Nichols after the turn of the 20th century, with Hayes in front, George Courts, one of his aides, just behind him, and David Shields behind. David Shields was the man who really kind of kept alive Hayes' memory for quite a number of years and will be heavily influential in making sure that Hayes was as best as possible, not forgotten.
Real quick, I just want to mention too, Dave Shields, actually, I believe he's one of the people who obviously gave an account after the fact. Shields mentions joining Hayes as they're riding up and down their line, and he describes it as almost like they're flying. He basically says he felt as if no one could shoot him, like they're invincible. And I believe it was Shields also who mentioned, I think it was Webb who claimed that Hayes had some of the flags that that the Philadelphia Brigade had captured. And Hayes is kind of, I think someone the other night when we had our last broadcast described Hayes as a sassy person. And this kind of shows his sassy personality. He basically tells Shields to send a few flags over to Webb because he already has too many to count. But anyway, I just want to kind of bring that up. That Shields, as you mentioned, was kind of his right-hand man, his confidant, and it's somebody that greatly admired Hayes and someone who kept Hayes' memory alive years after the Civil War.
Yeah, thank you, Rich, for mentioning that. And his account, Shields, is the longest of any of them. It's one of the last written in terms of its full breadth, but you can really tell the fact that he really looked at this as kind of a defining moment of his life. And I'll have a picture here in a few slides of his grave, but he chose to be buried in Gettysburg National Cemetery. And if you stand near his grave in the middle of the winter, you can kind of look across when the leaves are off the trees and see the general area where you can't quite see Hayes' statue, but that general area. So clearly heavily influenced. The man will live for 70 something years afterward. He's buried among World War II veterans, and but he keeps alive the memory of Hayes, pretty much as long as he could. And like Rich said, he says that he's not afraid during this time. He says the grandest ride men ever took is one of his lines. He says as they dragged these flags through, quote unquote, the dust and blood of the battlefield. And he says that for a time they're being shot at, and he says that they're weaving in and out of these wounded soldiers, and you can see that reflected in the painting. And ultimately, he says that it was the only time under fire where he didn't think about fear, and so it kind of gives you a sense of what it was like to have participated in this. A couple of these other little sassy occurrences at Gettysburg. Rich had mentioned about Alexander Webb. Webb was not a fan of Hayes. He said he was not capable of commanding a brigade. He's a real specimen of a weak, ignorant political appointment. He is nothing but a personally brave man, no head, no education, and vulgar beyond measure. And one of the reasons Webb might have felt that way, he wrote those words on August 8th, 1863, is in addition to being accused of stealing flags, and Hayes says, well, if I stole them, or if I didn't get them from the men who captured them, then how in the hell do I have them? Were his exact words. But he also has this line where, let me find it here. Webb says, Lewis Armistead and a number of his men got inside my lines and among some of my guns, and many were killed there. Hayes was unimpressed and boldly responded, they didn't touch any of my guns, and neither did a rebel fall within my lines. And Ezra Simons, who was the chaplain of the 125th New York, said that one rebel officer came within our line, looked about and asked, where are your men? He was pointed to the line and told, there they are, upon which he said, if I had known this is all you have, I would not have surrendered. General Hayes, in speech more emphatic than pious, said, go back and try it over. So another good sassy sort of Hayes line there. Just briefly, in kind of closing to his death here, in the months after Gettysburg, Hayes is going to desperately try to get a promotion. He's a brigadier general. He wants to become a major general. He feels that his conduct at Gettysburg was worthy of that. But he does correctly predict in a pessimistic manner, but he was right. He said that he felt as though his service at Gettysburg would not be, in his words, appreciated. And so he has these repeated claims that he puts into Andrew Curtin, Pennsylvania's governor. He's asking him for basically this recommendation, if he could, to the War Department of the United States to promote him to major general. And it never happens. And in fact, Hayes is actually demoted. He doesn't lose his generalship, but he loses his division and becomes a brigade commander in Getty's division of the Second Corps. And that is where he will be in the spring of 1864. This picture, one of my favorites of Hayes, is taken. He's in the center, surrounded by his staff in camp near Brandy Station, Virginia. This would have been in the winter of 63 to 64. I think this picture and one of him with the 17th Maine Band. Hayes was a big very much appreciated music. These are taken, I think, in March. He dies in May 2 months before his death. These are probably the last pictures that are ever taken of General Hayes. He has a couple of really interesting lines whenever he's requesting the possibility to be promoted. Some of them are tongue-in-cheek. Some of them are kind of dark humor. Some of them are really serious. He genuinely did think he was deserving of a second star. He says in one of these letters, December of 1863, it would gratify me much for the sake of others to have my coat adorned with another star and my purse replenished with increased salary. I have to say that the firm of Lincoln and Stanton has omitted to forward the second star I ordered at Gettysburg. Perhaps they have merely overlooked it. And time and again, he is going to kind of jokingly call out the president and the Secretary of War. The firm of Lincoln and Stanton, forwarders of stars, is what he eventually calls them. But he will also write this letter on April 15th, 1864, to Andrew Curtin, in which he says, in part, I would like your recommendation for promotion, quote unquote, before I get killed. And that's probably an attempt at dark humor, but of course, ultimately, it becomes a tragic premonition. And 156 years ago today, as we said on August 5th, 1864, Hayes is going to be holding on to near the crossroads of the Brock Road and the Orange Plank Road at the Wilderness, rides ahead of his men, and ultimately is going to be killed, struck in the skull by a bullet, and he will fall. There will be these accusations both at Wilderness when he died, as well as at Morton's Ford a couple of months earlier, that he was drunken in the saddle. If you read the biography called Fighting Ellick by Wayne Mahood, he has a nice appendix on this. Similar sort of accusations to Ulysses S. Grant, similar sort of conclusion that many historians have more recently drawn on Grant. Probably did drink, many in the Army did, probably not on the field though. And so it seems as though the people who throw these accusations at him in most instances were not near him on the battlefield, could not definitively have known, as well as some men from the 14th Connecticut who were sort of had this antipathy toward Hayes, and they felt he didn't give them proper credit after they had burned the Bliss Farm at Gettysburg. I'll end here just briefly and hand it over to Rich. I've probably rambled on too long here. With basically what it would have looked like. This scene looked like 156 years ago today, as Hayes's death and the news of it starts to spread throughout the Army. And what we will see is all levels, basically, of the Union Army, throughout the Army of the Potomac, all the way to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, will react within a couple of days to this news. Theodore Lyman, who was an aide to George Meade, commander of the Army of the Potomac, he was probably one of the first people who actually saw Hayes coming off the field. He said in a letter to his wife, "Up came Hayes's brigade, which disappeared in the woods, and in a few minutes, General Hayes was carried past me, covered with blood, shot through the head." General Hayes is killed. A memorandum to Secretary of War Stanton will state on May 8th. Winfield Hancock, 2nd Corps commander, in his official report grieved Brigadier General Alexander Hayes, that dauntless soldier whose intrepid and chivalric bearing on so many battlefields had won for him the highest renown, was killed at the head of his brigade. George Meade said Hayes, in going to repair the break in his line, was shot dead while gallantly leading his command in the thickest of the fight. Colonel Lyman again said Hayes was strong built, a rough sort of man, red hair and a tawny full beard. A braver man never went into action, and wonder is only that he was not killed before, as he always rode at the very head of his men, shouting at them and waving his sword. Ulysses S. Grant, Hayes' old friend, his old West Point fellow graduate, his counterpart in Mexico. When the news is brought to him, Horace Porter, Grant's famous aide de camp, will reflect upon that emotional scene at Army headquarters at the Wilderness. He said, "General Grant was by no means a demonstrative man, but upon learning the intelligence I brought, he was visibly affected. He was seated upon the ground with his back against a tree, whittling pine sticks. He sat for a time without uttering a word, and then, speaking in a low voice and pausing between the sentences, he said, 'Hayes and I were cadets together for 3 years. We served for a time in the same regiment in the Mexican War. He was a noble man and a gallant officer. I am surprised he met his death at the head of it. I am not surprised he met his death at the head of his troops. It was just like him. He was a man who would never follow, but would always lead in battle.'" And what you see there is a monument dedicated in 1905 those who tuned in the other night to our Chancellorsville discussion will recall that when this was dedicated, the people who came to the ceremony stopped briefly at Stonewall Jackson's death site nearby, just a couple of miles northeast of this position, from a year earlier at Chancellorsville when he was killed in 1863. And they sort of compare the two legacies of these men. The interesting piece of that, you will recall, is after Gettysburg, Hayes had sort of thrown rhetorical shade at the legacy of Stonewall Jackson. Again, this kind of anti-Confederate fervor. He said, "My defenses were like stone walls, and since Jackson is dead, I think I have a claim to his title." Here is a reproduction of the painting by Audley Nichols. This becomes pretty popular in the post-war years, as I said, in the 20th century. Hayes's statue at Gettysburg is going to be placed in 1915, I believe. It was supposed to be erected or dedicated rather multiple times. Didn't happen until 1982. They ran out of money due to the First World War initially. The can kind of got kicked down the road. On the left side, that map there, story for another time, but there was this age-long debate for years, decades really, on the placement of Hayes's monument. David Shields in particular, as well as Hayes's family, didn't think it was put in the correct location. They thought it should have been placed more prominently near the Abraham Bryan farm. And there's another map. This is from the 1930s when 1933, they're still genuinely debating whether that it should be moved, and ultimately it never was. I'll let Rich talk about his grave here in a second. There's the dedication of his monument, as I said, 1905 at the Wilderness. This man here is David Shields, that age-old acolyte of Hayes. There's a younger picture of Shields. And here I'll just touch on this briefly, is the monument to the 63rd Pennsylvania at Gettysburg. It's placed in 1889. At the top of it, if you go there today, you'll notice that the 3rd Corps insignia is on top in red to denote the 1st Division of the 3rd Corps. Apparently, these men did not initially dedicate their monument because it wasn't what they asked for. That was supposed to have been a depiction of Hayes. Whether it was a bust or a statue is not entirely clear. But when they got to Gettysburg in 1889, these veterans were pretty upset with the fact that Hayes was not put there. And they facetiously will call what is there the base burner stove. And apparently they didn't like how the monument eventually turned out. They will have a resolution unanimously adopted that says we disapprove of the present form and refuse to dedicate the monument. And they will cite the example of the 83rd Pennsylvania monument, a little round top with Strong Vincent on top. And they said, "You're telling us we can't put a figure on top of our monument, but Strong Vincent is there." And the Battlefield Memorial Association will shoot back with, "That's not really Strong Vincent. It's just a man who looks like Strong Vincent." And so ultimately, the men of the 63rd Pennsylvania do not get their wish. And lastly, there, David Shields, as I mentioned, there he is as an older man. And there's his grave at Gettysburg National Cemetery. As I said, he's buried alongside World War II veterans till the very end. He is kind of amplifying the role of Alexander Hayes and hoping that he would have a greater role in posterity than perhaps he actually did, or even some could say has, although there is certainly a growing group, I think, of Hayes aficionados in Pittsburgh and elsewhere. But that is kind of the story of Alexander Hayes and some of his legacy. I'll turn it over to Rich to talk a bit more about the legacy.
That was a good, concise history of Alexander Hayes, Cody.
Thanks.
Good job. If people are just kind of tuning in now or just recently, feel free to post any kind of questions in the comments, and we'll be happy to either address them on here or after this is all over, we'll reply to your question in the comments. Cody, I know one of the questions that somebody posted was who painted the depiction of Hayes dragging the flags at Pickett's charge?
So that was Audley Dean Nichols, which, as far as I can tell, is the only Civil War or military, for that matter, painting that he had ever created. I think he was mostly, let me look at my notes here, I think he was mostly a Western landscape artist. Yeah, he was a landscape artist, and he was from Sewickley, Pennsylvania, which was where Shields was from, in Pittsburgh area. And famously with that painting, that there was an article called "The Famous Missing Painting" in spring 2003 edition of Western Pennsylvania magazine. by Brian Butko. You can find that online. That's where I found the colorized version of the painting. But he has this story about how Shields' sister, her name was Wilhelmina, she had the painting until she died. And nobody really knows what happened to the original since that period. You can find, versions of it, but the original was apparently considered by her to be offensive. People famously knew that she didn't like the depiction. And that kind of goes back to that idea that even the written accounts of Hayes's actions, the published ones in newspapers, were sometimes censored. And when Audley Dean Nichols created that, apparently that was the case as well. Fortunately, we are left with a little pamphlet called General Alexander Hayes at Gettysburg, the non-colorized version. And that's a version that you'll typically see in books, or I think the old cyclorama at Gettysburg used to have a version of that on display as well.
Okay. Well, real quick.
And briefly, just with the painting, sorry, that painting, David Shields will fight as well. In addition to the placement of the monument, he wanted there to be a bas relief of that at the bottom of Hayes's statue at Gettysburg, and that never happened. But I think that would be a fascinating what if of Gettysburg memory. What if there was a depiction of a federal officer dragging Confederate flags? I couldn't imagine that, though. But I think that his
interpretation in 2020, I'll tell you that.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that's the importance of Hayes's flag dragging story. It's an early example. It's a wartime example of this sentiment that proves that our debates are nothing new with regard to symbols of the Confederacy, for instance.
All right. So real quick, I just want to kind of backpedal a little bit. Cody, you mentioned Hayes really believing in his own promotion, that he really deserved it in the spring of 1864. And he wasn't alone. There's a lot of people who believe that Hayes should have an extra star on his shoulder. And I found this account earlier. I was kind of digging through yesterday and found this account from the Pittsburgh Daily Commercial that came out not even 2 weeks before Hayes was killed at the Wilderness. So Hayes was making headlines even before his death in May of 1864. The Daily Commercial believed that Hayes should be promoted as well. And they said, when we name our heroes, his name is in the foreground, and there are but a few who will not distinguish him as worthy the title of the bravest of the brave. The field and line officers of the 3rd Division, 2nd Corps, have united in a request to the President for the promotion of Hayes to the rank of Major General. And our prominent citizens have memorialized the legislature to ask this act of justice from Mr. Lincoln as due to the Commonwealth. Public justice is sometimes slow, but we are unwilling to believe that its certainty is doubtful. The eye of a Napoleon could distinguish between the simulated and the real. He knew his heroes, and they took their places by a law as certain as gravitation. Unfortunately for us in this gigantic war, faithful, heroic men have held subordinate places, and the timid and incapable have been our leaders. So that's one of the thoughts of the people back home in Pittsburgh is, one of their Western Pennsylvania hometown heroes who's put so much work into his military career should be advanced a lot further than he actually was. Now, kind of moving forward to the death of Alexander Hayes. Let me pull up my little PowerPoint here. Bear with me real quick. All right, so this is the man, the myth, the legend, Alexander Hayes, as you had seen before. And one second. Hayes' death, actually news of his death, did not reach Pittsburgh until 2 days later on May 7th. There was actually a letter that was written to the Honorable Thomas Howe, who was Assistant Adjutant General in Western Pennsylvania. This correspondence is actually going to be written by Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War in Washington. And he said, "I deeply regret to inform you that intelligence has just reached this department that in the engagement near Chancellorsville on Thursday, Brigadier General Alexander Hayes of Pittsburgh was killed at the head of his command while gallantly maintaining his position against a superior force. His remains are believed to be in possession of our forces, but there is no means of communication with the Army. You will please communicate this sad intelligence to Mr. John B. McFadden, his father-in-law, and the family of General Hayes. The remains will be forwarded as soon as they reach here, which may not be for some days, as the Army is between 30 and 40 miles in advance of railroad or telegraphic communication, and there is no means of transportation. No casualties to any other officer is reported. And so Hayes is killed. The news is going to reach Pittsburgh. The community, a majority of the community, are kind of shocked by his death, as he was kind of a staple in the community, especially in the Allegheny City community before the American Civil War and at the start of the American Civil War. So Hayes's body is going to reach the Pittsburgh area on May 13th, 1864. The next day, May 14th, is when they're actually going to hold his funeral. And so what you're looking at right here, this is actually the Penn Avenue entrance to Allegheny Cemetery in Pittsburgh's Lawrenceville neighborhood. I apologize for the terrible crop job, but you can see on the lower left-hand corner there the main gates to the gatehouse from Penn Avenue, and that's actually how Hayes's body is going to access the cemetery on May 14th. The funeral procession itself is going to start in downtown Pittsburgh. They're going to hold the funeral at the First Presbyterian Church on Wood Street. And there's going to be several thousand people who pass through the church for Hayes' funeral. And then his body is going to be accompanied to Allegheny Cemetery for his final burial. He's going to have a detail of about records kind of indicate anywhere between 300 and 500 U.S. soldiers accompanying Hayes' body to his final resting place. As they start turning the corner into this gate that you're seeing in the picture, there is actually artillery fire. Captain Joseph Knapp of Knapp's Pittsburgh Battery is going to be firing artillery rounds in memory of Alexander Hayes as they start to enter the cemetery. And the procession is going to move downward down the hill to Hayes' final resting place, which is only just a couple hundred feet away, or I guess about 100 yards away from the gatehouse here on Penn Avenue. And Hayes is going to be laid to his final resting place. Hayes is going to receive a grave marker, a very elaborate grave marker, toward the end of 1865, early 1866, you can see here. Now, this isn't the original one that was placed at his grave. This is the second version of it, because the first one actually deteriorated pretty quickly. This one was cast in granite and was mainly paid for really by the men of the 63rd Pennsylvania Infantry, his first regiment that he led, or I guess you could say, first regiment that he led in the American Civil War. This grave site is going to be the scene of many gatherings from that point forward. For anybody who lives in the Western Pennsylvania or Pittsburgh area and maybe has attended a Memorial Day parade in Lawrenceville, it's the biggest in the nation. And since they started celebrating Memorial Day or Decoration Day, this is where a lot of Union veterans kind of amalgamated at the end of each parade. This is kind of the focal point. This is the focus point for all these veterans in Allegheny Cemetery. So you can see that there are several cannons that are kind of lining Hayes's plot. Those were all donated by the U.S. government. This plot of land where the monument actually stands now was donated by Allegheny Cemetery. So you can kind of see how much this man meant to the local community. Now, after Hayes is buried several years later, in 1868, Ulysses S. Grant, his really good friend, who he had known for years before the American Civil War, and you heard Cody kind of mention Grant's reaction to Hayes's death after the wilderness. He's going to be in Pittsburgh. And there's an account that's actually shared by Jared Brush, who was the mayor of Pittsburgh at the time, he talks about accompanying Grant through Allegheny Cemetery and to Hayes' grave during his visit. So I'm going to read that to you real quick here. Brush said, "I remember what a pleasant time we had together during the big German Sanger Fest out at Friendship Grove in 1868. General Grant, then a candidate, went out with a party of us and we had a jovial time with the Germans. The general himself were in a carriage together returning, and when we were near the cemetery, he turned to me and said, 'Can you tell me where General Alexander Hayes' grave is?' I told him it was not 100 yards off. 'Drive me to it,' said Grant. The driver was given the necessary order, and we were soon beside the grave of General Hayes, as we generally call him. General Grant stepped out of the carriage, and we walked around the grave, reading on the monument the brilliant war record of the deceased soldier. After spending a few minutes thus, he sat down on one of the cannon near the monument and appeared to be wrapped in deep thought. I turned aside, and when I again looked at Grant, he was weeping like a child. I said nothing, and when we entered the carriage and were driven to the city, not a word passed between us until we were near our destination, when he turned to me with the remark, 'Has General Hayes any relatives here?' I told him his wife and her parents, the McFadens, were still living. He said, 'Drive me to the residence, if it is not too much trouble,' said he. And together we went over to the house where the general was introduced to the family and talked with them for a short time. From the time I saw him beside the grave of Hayes, weeping, I have always thought Grant was a man with his heart in the right place. It struck me as strange to see him weeping, but he and Alexander Hayes were classmates and soldiers together, and no doubt the words on the monument brought to his memory old scenes. General Meade made the same request to see Hayes' grave when he was here. And I believe, if I remember right, Meade was in the Pittsburgh area in 1871 when they dedicated the Allegheny County Soldiers Monument in Allegheny City. There's a few other accounts that, first off, I want to kind of do a little promotion of this book. Cody had mentioned this earlier. It's the Life and Letters of Alexander Hayes. It's an excellent read. If you're to try to ever get a copy in your hands, an original copy, it can run upwards of $1,500. So I highly recommend taking a look on, you can Google it and find a digitized copy of this book. There's a lot of great accounts. Many accounts toward the end of the publication are letters that were written to Hayes' son, Gilbert Hayes, talking about their wartime memories of his father. And one of the accounts I actually wanted to read earlier on, and I just forgot to mention it, was from a guy in Company D of the 62nd Pennsylvania Infantry, which is also a unit from the Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania area. The man's name is William Smith. And in 1913, he wrote this letter to Gilbert. He said, "Dear Sir, I was a soldier in Company D, 62nd Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. I was severely wounded at the Battle of Malvern Hill, Virginia in July of 62 and was left on the field when the Army marched away to Harrison's Landing." And this account, by the way, kind of gives you a good glimpse into Hayes' character as a person. He continues, "Suffering from my wound, tired, hungry, and weak from loss of blood, I followed the Army, making but a few steps between stops to rest. On the evening of July 4th, I came in sight of the picket line, but was entirely exhausted and could not go any further. It had been raining, and I became stuck in the mud and fell down. I was not able to arise. If it had not been for your father, I would have been there yet. He had been out along the picket line and with his field glass discovered me. He rode out to where I was in the mire and picked me up and put me on his horse and carried me inside the lines and down to the landing and put me on the Ocean Queen that was just ready for sail for New York. To that act of his, I owe my life. He was killed before any opportunity came to me to meet him again and acknowledge the debt." So as I said, I wanted to mention that a little bit earlier, but it kind of gives a good glimpse into Hayes' personality, aside from being a federal commander, kind of a hard-nosed guy, but still appreciated by his men. And there's one more that I want to share with you as well. This is actually from a gentleman in the 6th Wisconsin Infantry from the Iron Brigade, the famed Iron Brigade. This is actually written by General Jerome Watrous in 1911. And this is in reference to the book that you're viewing right now, Life and Letters of Alexander Hayes. Gilbert Adams Hayes is going to be sending some copies to men that were associated with Hayes or had served under his command. And this is a response from Watrous. And keep in mind, when he was in the 6th Wisconsin during the American Civil War, he's serving in the ranks. He's not an officer quite yet. He said, "I had my favorites in the Army. Among them was your father. As the years have come and gone and we reason along new lines, our estimates are readjusted, and at least mine have been. Your father stood very high when I was a young man. I now see him in a very different light and estimate him much more highly. Personally, and in behalf of the thousands of other men of the Army of the Potomac who still live, I want to thank you for your decision to publish the book that is soon to appear. It will be a lesson in patriotism. No man, young or old, and indeed no woman, girl, or boy will read it without having faith in the institutions of the country for which your father gave his life, increased and their love for it greatly added to. The plainest, simplest story of General Hayes' life will be an inspiration to all who may read it. I rejoice to learn that a history in book form of this distinguished soldier and superb type of man is to be given to the public. And it would delight my heart to know that hundreds of thousands of young men would have an opportunity to peruse its pages, for I am confident that such a reading would add materially to their good citizenship, their faith in and love for the land which General Hayes served so well and for which he died." So those, as I mentioned, those are just a few accounts from the life and letters of Alexander Hayes, and some accounts that really kind of shine a light on Hayes, not just as a soldier and a commander, but a civilian and a person. And so with that being said, we're going to start wrapping up our chat here tonight. As I mentioned before, if any of you have any comments or any questions, please feel free to comment in the comment section, and we'll get to your questions as soon as possible. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up. And Cody, do you have any final comments?
Yeah, I just want to say that I think Alexander Hayes, for all the reasons we've talked about, fascinating figure worth studying, an individual who for a long time, was so beloved by his men, kind of falls into obscurity for quite a while. But I think conversations like this one for individuals like him, certainly worthy of having. The most fascinating thing to me about Hayes is the transition that I don't think we often see play out in Civil War soldiers. And I kind of addressed this matter a while ago, but I do want to go just briefly through as kind of a parting note on what is the evolution of someone from being this kind of conservative war Democrat to someone who calls Abraham Lincoln America's prophet, in his words. What does that look like? And if you go through the life and letters of Alexander Hayes and you read the letters that his son and that George Thornton Fleming, the editor and author, chose, you can really see this play out. As I mentioned, he starts the war, says that he wishes Camp Curtin was named in memory of Andrew Curtin. He says that the governor's down on everybody from Pittsburgh. Of course, Curtin is a Republican as well. He says at one point, we have no distrust of George McClellan's ability to carry us through.
Cody, I think we might have lost you there. Still, you still with us? Uh-oh. All right, well, Cody, hopefully you'll join us here, or hopefully you're still with us. But I first want to thank all of you for tuning in this evening, and hopefully we get Cody back here shortly. But thank you all for joining, and I would like to, let's see here real quick. I'd like to thank you all for joining tonight. Thank you all for watching. We will be having a few more of these here in the future while we're all on lockdown with with COVID-19. And Cody,
There we go.
I think we lost you.
What's that?
I was stalling time. Did you lose connection?
Yeah, I must have. Yeah.
All right, no worries. Did you have anything else you wanted to finish with?
I don't know where you lost me, but I'll just briefly give this account. Basically, we go from Hayes commending McClellan and thinking that his is the way to go, opposing Lincoln, opposing kind of a radical view of this war. And then all of a sudden in 1863, we start to see him saying things like McClellanism is very weak. McClellan's intercourse of late with Copperheads is damning him in the estimation of his old friends. At one point, he says McClellan is associated with treason and mockery. But then he says McClellan men are settling into the background of army affairs. And at one point, he says, and this is the most fascinating line I think I've seen Hayes or almost any Civil War general ever write. It's one that I always come back to when I think of Hayes's personality. He tells Andrew Curtin in 1864, "It is positively false, as I have seen represented, that any McClellanism or any other manism exists in this army. If our representatives in Congress can't purge our national halls from the foul taint of treason and sedition, we can fumigate with gunpowder and let out corrupt blood with the bayonet." So literally saying the former commander of the army is now equivalent in his mind with treason. And in that same letter, he will say, our army was never so well prepared. This is just 3 weeks before he dies at the Wilderness, or rather will be when we move to meet the rebels. We have faith in Sam Grant and unwavering devotion to the government through Abraham Lincoln, its prophet. And so that is a fascinating transition for an individual to go through in just a little more than 2 years or so. And then I'll end just with this briefly. We mentioned David Shields many times. Shields writes what I think is the best reflection of anybody who knew Hayes, both in terms of his flag ride at Gettysburg, as well as just kind of a general legacy. And Shields is one of many who reported on what he witnessed at Gettysburg and really puts Hayes at kind of the top echelon of individuals in his life and in his Civil War career. People were saying that Hayes's name should be over top of Arlington National Cemetery, right near the names of people like Grant and Sherman. And certainly I think Shields likely would have agreed with that. In Shields' account, he says, to General Hayes and the men of his division, we had equal zest and equal enthusiasm. He's talking about the flag ride as we rode the line in glorious celebration of our victory. Only General Alexander Hayes could have inspired such a scene. Shall history fail to keep in bright renown this story of General Alexander Hayes? In the story of Hayes and his men, there is but one commanding thought, and that is victory. And I think that that's a really nice way to summarize this man in life and in death. Of course, he will die at the head of his men, ultimately successful, and really in a piece we haven't touched upon, but you can go and look at some of my recent posts. I have one about to come up as a piece for PennCivilWar, an individual who in the last weeks of his life has a sort of eerie premonition, we could say, of his death and seems comfortable and peaceful. He's equal parts kind of frustrated at the possible course that the war could take. He's worried for the future of his country and the future of his army, but he's also at peace with knowing that if his time should come, if he should die, that it would be in the name of a redeemed republic. And I think that that's a wonderful legacy that Shields says that he has one commanding thought, and that is victory.
That's very well said. And I really think that compared to many other federal officers, Hayes' memory after the war is something that kind of launched to stardom, I feel like, after his death. A lot of these people care about him so much that they continue for years and decades after the American Civil War to keep his memory alive. And now you see that kind of thing in a lot of the museums in Pittsburgh and, Civil War roundtables and really anything Civil War related in Western Pennsylvania. A lot of these people are big fans of Alexander Hayes. He's like a household name if you're in the Western Pennsylvania area and you're a Civil War buff. Real quick, I wanted to touch on, we've had a few comments and questions on the live feed. One of them is from our friend Dana Schoaf. Are there any Hayes descendants in the Pittsburgh area? So yes, I believe there are still Hayes descendants in Western Pennsylvania. I think more particularly Sewickley, which is where Shields is from originally. And then any other questions that are posted here in the comments section, we'll take care of right after we wrap up this discussion. I have a couple final words. First off, if anybody's watched our last broadcast about the fight at Chancellorsville, I was sitting on a box. I am actually sitting on I am sitting on a stool now. I actually have a chair. My furniture is not quite here yet in Beaufort, South Carolina, but I did get some furniture from Amazon, and that is good. So I'm not sinking into my chair as this broadcast drags on. Secondly, and I always like to end with this, everyone, please wash your hands. Please wash your face. Don't touch your face. Wear face masks if you're in a populated area. And then before you know it, we'll be able to do these broadcasts from the battlefield, live from the battlefield, where we like to see it, not from our furnitureless apartments. So with that being said, I want to thank you all for watching this evening. As I said many times, please leave comments, questions. We'll be happy to get them to you, answers to you. And Cody, with his future publications on Alexander Hayes, will be posting those on Pennsylvania in the Civil War blog, as well as the Facebook. And I'll definitely be sharing that to the Civil War Pittsburgh page.
That's your teaser, everybody. That's the opening page of it there. It's let's see, 54 pages altogether, so you'll get plenty there.
Perfect. All right, well, thank you all, and everybody have a great night and an excellent week. We'll be seeing you soon. I believe as of now, the next scheduled broadcast we have is May 15th. We'll be speaking with our good friend Dana Schoaf from Civil War Times Magazine. Thank you all, and have a great night.
Thanks, everybody.